Welcome to the Jameel Rawls Show, and today I'm going to be going over my experience of the educational system growing up and what education means to me today, and we're going to go over some education for the listeners. Now, first and foremost, I'm from Michigan, from the Muskegon area, Muskegon Heights area. I ended up going to school, a lot of different schools. One of the things I quickly took notice to is how much the students don't want to be inside the classrooms. Growing up, I used to see a lot of students that just did not want to be in school. There was a few of them who enjoyed it and who got good grades, but the majority of them that went to school did not want to be there. And the students came from all walks of life. I remember one high school I went to, it was a really nice high school, and I was shocked at how many of the privileged students were on drugs. They would do things like snort Adderall pills, snort Ritalin pills, smoke pot. Even in high school, they wanted coke. They wanted to snort coke. And some of these students were like on the upper preppy, scale. Nice. As soon as they turned 16, they got a really nice car. Parents, really nice houses on the lake. And it kind of boggled my mind that they were so into getting drunk and using drugs. And looking at the black community in Muskegon Heights, oftentimes I see crack smokers, crackheads. I'm related to, there's people I'm related to who abuse drugs, those sorts of drugs. And so I would see in impoverished and in very poverty-stricken neighborhoods, crime-stricken neighborhoods, people abusing cocaine. Then I would see in upper-class neighborhoods in the Grand Haven area, Spring Lake area, I would see, students who didn't need to ask for anything, using the same drugs, using cocaine, using pills, ecstasy. And so it made me really think, years later, I really thought about it. But even at the time, I used to think, why is it like this? And I realized that there's really no spiritual presence in the educational system. A lot of the emphasis is placed on material objects and material gain. Like, you will, at some point in the future, be able to make this amount of money. Or, right now it's important that you do this and you do that. And so the students they wanted to use drugs as a way to escape. And it was amazing how many younger women had premarital sex. And it just was going through high school. I used to see all sorts of stuff, and I used to be like, wow, at this age, people are doing this. At this age, 15, 16, people are using hard drugs. And I sit there and watch my classmates do stuff like that. And I wasn't interested in the education. I didn't like school. I did not like the public. I'm in the private schools, public schools. I've been to inner city schools. I've been to schools out in rural areas. I went through all sorts of schools. And at the end of the day, my impression of the educational system was it's not really based on the spiritual, psychological, educational development of the student, especially with prayer being removed out of the school. You never hear God spoken of in the school. Unless, of course, maybe you go to a Catholic school or whatnot. But, it was very interesting. And one of the subjects I kept coming across, at least in my era in school, from time to time, you would hear the Cold War. And the educational system, at least, where I grew up at, did nothing to teach people about the Cold War. It did nothing to teach people about the facts of America's relationship with the Soviet Union. Matter of fact, it lied more than anything. The educational system told lie after lie to the students about world history and world politics. And becoming an independent researcher and doing a lot of conspiracy research, I was able to examine those lies and address those lies and gather the proper information for myself. But I still look at my classmates. They're out in the workforce. These people are married. They're working jobs. And a lot of them, I wish the best for all of them. But I've come across a lot of them that look very unhappy. And I realized, these people believed in the education. These people believed in the educational system. Their parents probably believed in it. They believed in the money they were spending on college when they went there. Did they know they were being misled and lied to? That's part of the whole thing. And so I encourage people now more than ever to keep education going, to keep learning, keep studying. Right now, we're gonna go to we're gonna go to some stuff on the Cold War. One of the biggest lies we were taught in school was that the Soviet Union was was a serious threat to the United States of America, and we as Americans did not know what the Soviet Union was up to, and we were to be afraid of them. And at any minute they could drop the bomb. I remember even when I was in first, second grade, we hid under our desk at one time. Now that I have the proper education on the subject, I realize that much of that is not true. That the Soviet Union was actually built by American companies, and so that's one of the educational lessons I think for the youth growing up today is to re-examine what was going on with the educational system back in like going back to at the last era of the 80s primarily, and why were people living in fear? Why were people not being educated properly? And we're going to look at some educational material dealing, and I'm going to leave a link up. I'm going to leave some links up. A Cosmopolitan Project, Dream Worlds of Mass Culture. This is a newspaper article from the New York Times, June 4th, 1929. Dreams of Mass Culture. Soviet industry gets American aid. Contracts involving millions with industry here are disclosed. So, right here in the newspaper article, which I'm going to leave a link up so everybody can look at it, it says Soviet industry gets American aid. Contracts involving millions with industry here are disclosed. Ford cooperation lauded. Details of Soviet contracts with more than 15 American concerns involving millions of dollars were made public yesterday in a joint statement issued by Valery I. Meshlak, Vice Chairman of the Supreme Economic Council of the Soviet Union, and Saul G. Braun, Chairman of the Board of Amtorg Trading Corporation, 261 Fifth Avenue. Among the outstanding of these contracts is the one with Ford Motor Company signed at Dearborn, Michigan last Friday, at which time it was announced that this agreement calls for the purchase of 30 million worth of Ford cars and parts by the Russian interest within the next 4 years. So I'm going to stop there for a second. You have a well-known American company, Ford Motor Company, and a contract of $30 million back in 1929. What the equivalent of that today would be. Whew. The other contracts call for designing of plants, okay, technical assistance, and exchange of patents. The statement issued yesterday at the office of Amtorg Trading Corporation, which was one of the parties to Ford Motor Company contract, said that it is significant that American engineering skill is being utilized on many of the principal Soviet industrial projects now underway. So, this is a very, very interesting article. Basically, the Soviet Union did not have the resources or the technical skills to build themselves up to be the equivalent of the United States, or to be actually in a opposition to the United States. They didn't have that. They were built up by the United States companies. And that's the funny thing, is no one ever, in school, you never had the proper education on this subject. This is very fascinating. And I remember Samantha Smith was a little girl. She wrote Yuri Andropov a letter at one point, and she was afraid of a nuclear arms war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Yuri Andropov told her, like, hey, we were America's friends at one time. We helped America defeat the Nazis. She actually got to go meet. She went to the Soviet Union. I don't think she met Yuri Andropov, but she did go there. The Soviet Union welcomed her with open arms, and she, which was very nice. They invited her to the country, and she spent time there. And she came back. Her family went with her too, and she came back. She was considered an ambassador of peace at one time. Unfortunately, Samantha Smith supposedly died in a plane crash, which was very unfortunate. She was a very nice-looking young girl. I think that hurt a lot of people to see that. But, get on with the article. Um, Soviet industry gets American. So that's the first article right there. And in Detroit, you had Albert Kahn and Associates, who built up Moscow, who built up the power plants in Russia. Matter of fact, I'm going to stop on this article and just go to Albert Kahn Associates on the Wikipedia page. And these are Detroit companies. Like Michigan built the Soviet Union. You know? Ain't that something? The firm started by Albert Kahn built factories for Chrysler. Okay, the firm started by Albert Kahn built factories for Chrysler for over a decade, Ford Automobile for 30 years, and Packard Automobile for 35 years. Other important clients of the firm were Republic Steel and General Motors. The firm was awarded $40 million contract to build a tractor factory in Russia in 1928. The firm's output was over $1 million worth of work per week by 1929. By 1939, the firm designed 19% of all industrial buildings in the United States and had designed some 80 million of buildings worldwide. And they do have some very, very luxurious buildings. Albert Kahn building, front entrance. This is right in Detroit. Like, you had real communists in Detroit building buildings and they built up the Soviet Union. Albert Kahn established a Detroit firm in 1895. This is just basic stuff. I'm going to go back to the article. Okay, a cosmopolitan project. At the start of the first 5-year plan, Soviet engineers came to visit Albert Kahn. Okay, so that's the guy we were just talking about. At the start of the first 5-year plan, Soviet engineers came to visit Albert Kahn Company Incorporated of Detroit. The famous industrial architects who had built Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, as well as factories of General Motors, Packard, Oldsmobile, Chrysler, and DeSoto. This was around the time of the Prohibition. I wonder what Kahn and Associates were doing. I wonder if they were concerned with the Prohibition. It was in Detroit is full of little tunnels and stuff during the Prohibition. A good friend of mine, his grandmother owned a house in Detroit going back to the early 1900s, and she had hidden cellars in her basement where they would keep booze at during the Prohibition. It was in 1928, because they would bring it from Canada. They would bring the booze in from Canada right over from Windsor to Detroit across the Little River right there. And they'd sell it down, eastward or southward or westward. It was in 1928, the most extraordinary commission ever given. An architect came in the door unannounced. In that year, a group of engineers from the USSR came to the Kahn office with an order for a 40,000 tractor plant at this is a Russian word, Chelyabinsk, and an outline of a program for an additional $2 billion worth of buildings. $2 billion in 1928? Get out of here. About a dozen of these factories that's like 200 trillion. $2 billion in 1928 is like 20,000 trillion or something. About a dozen of these factories were done in Detroit. The rest were handled in a special office with 1,500 draftsmen in Moscow. So, hold up a minute. So, a bunch of agents from the Soviet Union came to the United States of America in Detroit and did a business deal to build up the Soviet Union with billions of dollars. I never read that in any history book when growing up in Michigan. According to Anthony Sutton, the Cold War historian who documented this case, the first outline of a program presented to the Kahn organization in 1928 was nothing less than the first. And Anthony Sutton, he's a well-educated man coming from the Hoover Institution or Hoover Foundation, I believe. Cultural for the masses, and second 5-year plans of socialist construction, and authorizing this act of extreme cosmopolitanism, Stalin envisioned a U.S. capitalist firm as designer of Soviet socialist industrialization. Wait a minute. Oh, stop here. Joseph Stalin Imagine the United States of America as capitalist, the designer of the Soviet Union. Get out of here. A factory produced Fords and tractors were prefabricated in Detroit by Albert Kahn Company and shipped to Stalingrad in 1929, where it was assembled under the direction of American engineers, a contract under which the Kahn Company became consulting architects. The Soviet Union was signed in early 1930. The Kahn Group undertook design, architectural, and engineering work for all heavy and light industrial units projected by Gosplan, Kahn's chief engineer in the USSR. Skrimgor was chairman of the Beseneka Building Committee. This is what he wrote. Skrimgor wrote, I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but the Albert Kahn unit was engaged to control, teach, and design all light and heavy industry. By the end of the second year, we controlled in Moscow and from Moscow branches in Leningrad, Krakow, Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, Odessa, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, 3,000 designers and completed design of buildings costing, these are Soviet figures, 407 million rubles. That's amazing. So this article shows photographs of the mass production, and this is during the this is the height of the industrial age. Like, this is extremely impressive to look at this. And just defeating the Nazis, that's exactly what the Americans and the Soviets did, was they blew up all the Nazis, anywhere the Nazis kept gas in Europe, gasoline or oil, or their plants. They defeated the Nazis more economically than militarily. Dreams of mass culture. Steel plant at Gary, Indiana. Construction began in 1906 by Fern and Company that provided the model for USSR's Magnitostro. Wait a minute. This reminds me of CocaCola City. Get out of here. This reminds me of CocaCola City. For those of you who don't know CocaCola City, I think it's CocaCola City. Hold on a second. There was a city in Russia that looked just like that, was built in the model of an American town. And I believe it was called Coca-Cola City.
Main Street. It's not so very different from thousands like it all over the United States.
Yeah, this is a special training facility complete with duplicates of building, streets, and businesses used to train Soviet agents in Western culture before sending them to the United States. I believe it's called Coca-Cola City. Anyway, I'm going to finish with the reading. Okay, so this reminded me of Coca-Cola City for some reason, because they're saying they have a plant in Gary, Indiana, and it is like the protege for the plant that they're going to create in the Soviet Union. Know-how for almost no outlay. The Austin Company of Cleveland designed not only the plant at Nizhny Novgorod, but the worker city that surrounded it, complete with community housing, nursery, public bath, palace, and culture and crematorium. See, this is real education right here. No wonder why all the kids were on drugs in high school. Culture for the masses. The technology transfer included trained personnel high up in the Soviet Economic Administration. Just go. I want to find an interesting article in here. I'm gonna leave the link up, of course, but this is gigantic. Margaret Bork White Mag Tort. I can't even pronounce it. 1931. Gigantic, huge building built in the Soviet Union by American companies. So I'm gonna leave this up as a link. Then Albert Kahn and Associates. Albert Kahn and Associates is in the same article. The organ even shows you the organ. My God, the internet shows you everything. People don't understand how lucky they are to have the internet. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you never would have been able to find. You wouldn't even find this 20 years ago. Most people wouldn't have. 20 years ago, you would have had to go to these companies and pay money and spend a lot of money and time and a lot of hard research to figure this stuff out. Now you can just, it's right at your fingertips. They got the whole layout of Albert Kahn and Associates on the internet. Chief Administrator, Assistant Administrator, Secretaries, Technical Division. You can learn a lot reading this stuff. If you really wanted an education, don't go to college. Print this stuff out and study it and read it and keep cross-referencing it. The firm's largest design job in Detroit was to design Children's Hospital of Michigan. His next major project came in 1898 from James E. Scripps to design an elaborate library with an art gallery. The Scripps, see, this is crazy. All in Michigan, too. These buildings were huge. Albert Kahn's historical. That is so interesting. All those years people like hated the Soviet Union and talked so bad about the Soviet Union, and all those American companies who built the Soviet Union. That's unbelievable. My interpretation is they were selling the public. They were selling the public fear. That's my interpretation. Oh, that's beautiful, Billy. He did a good job. Albert Kahn had skills. On the Jameel Rawls show, and I'll leave the links for people to check out. And I guess this could be a really useful project if somebody was in high school or if they were in college and they wanted to do something unique. They could read these articles, read this information, print the newspaper clippings out, and produce a well documented presentation. Yeah, this is good stuff.